Professor Rebecca Cruz joins me today to talk about this concept of tolerance. Now that we've been studying the concepts of culture and identity, let's talk a little bit about what we mean by tolerance. So Professor Cruz, the students have read a little bit about what tolerance means, and particularly the most tolerant countries around the world. But this is a tricky thing to measure. How do we even know tolerance when we see it, or intolerance when we see it?
It is very tricky to measure, as you mentioned, and again, it's one of those things that you know it when you see it. In the article, of course, it was measured by looking at a battery of questions from the World Values Survey that asked whether people would be comfortable having a neighbor of another race next to them. And that's one way to measure it, and maybe your students could come up with some other ways to measure this, but I think context is important. Countries that have had conflict in the past where there's ethnic differences, those are going to be countries that perhaps have some issues. Other places might not have those issues to overcome, so history, culture, context all matter when we're talking about tolerance.
So speaking of that, this does raise this issue of cultural relativism and whether culture is something that can transcend borders. Are there universal concepts, for example, that transcend borders? So let's talk a little bit about what we mean by cultural relativism and how that relates to universal ideas that really span the globe.
Yeah, when we're talking about cultural relativism, obviously that's this idea that we have to look at different cultures as being their own entities with their own unique qualities. And then on the other side of that, we can look at universalisms or universal norms, and these two things often come into conflict. If we have things that are considered near universal norms, like the treatment of women perhaps, that may come into conflict in how some of these cultures interpret their beliefs and how they act. So one of the issues that often comes up in this is women's rights, particularly perhaps in the Middle East when we're looking at the wearing of the veil, the hijab, or driving a car in Saudi Arabia. Should we be culturally sensitive and accept these things, or are there universal norms of women's rights and protections that we should be more concerned about? And this is an ongoing debate.
That is a very good example, I think, of cultural relativism, where in some parts of the world it would be troubling to have women having to cover themselves or not having the same rights as other members of society. But let's think about something that might be universal in nature. Perhaps a concept like the right to life. I mean, the value of life might vary from place to place, or does it? I mean, is this something that we can consider fairly universal?
I think it's probably our most universal norm or near universal norm, but even when we think about the right to life, there are some instances where countries or peoples think that it is okay to take a life. For example, in a wartime situation, self-defense. In this country, we have a capital punishment. So those are instances where it is no longer universal.
Well, definitely a very tricky subject, something not easy to define. But you tell us what you think. Is culture a relative concept or something that can be universal in nature?